A lot of other aspects of the film that are historically accurate. The way that, for example, the receiving room or the accident department at the London hospital is depicted is quite accurate. A lot of the hospital scenes seem quite accurate. There are lots of picture references, the makeup, for example, the uniform of the nurses, the costume, all of that is fairly accurate. The operating theatre scene probably isn't 100% accurate, and although Treves had some bad days when as many as 50% of his patients might not have survived an operation, by and large he was a successful surgeon, and he wrote a lot of surgical textbooks which remained in print for many years after his death.
Mr. Merrick, I have very great pleasure in being able to welcome you officially to the London hospital. This morning the governing committee unanimously voted that you should be provided with these rooms on a permanent basis. This is your home now. I'm so very, very glad for you.
Welcome home, lad.
After about a year in the hospital, 2 rooms were converted for Joseph to live in. He had a bed-sitting room and a bathroom adjoining it. And the bathroom's significant, of course, because Frederick Treves tells us that Joseph had to have a bath every day. Otherwise, a noxious smell would come from fetid material gathering in his skin. In the film, the head of the nursing staff is played by a lady called Mrs. Mothershead. In reality, the head of the nursing staff was the matron Eva Luckers, who was only 26 years old when she was appointed in 1880. The nurses who looked after Joseph, well, we know about one in particular, and that's Nurse Emma Ireland. Now, I've been able to trace that Emma Ireland was on duty in Cotton Ward, which is where Joseph lived when he was first admitted to the hospital in 1886. So the young actress who drops the tray, bringing up Joseph's supper to his room, I think is meant to portray Emma Ireland. The other characters in the film that are based on historical fact, well, one very prominent one, of course, is Francis Carr-Gomm, the hospital chairman, who's played by John Gielgud in the film. Now, Francis Carr-Gomm was chairman of the London Hospital during Joseph's lifetime, and he was indeed the person who wrote to the Times newspaper asking for subscriptions, which led to the establishment of the Merrick Fund, where £250 was subscribed by the readers of the Times, which allowed for Joseph to be maintained at the hospital. He presents the case of Joseph Merrick to the Hospital House Committee, who were in charge of the day-to-day running of the hospital, and he puts the case very powerfully, as portrayed in the minutes. He says that Joseph was a most unfortunate man who was destitute when he was brought to the hospital, and he had sought to have Joseph admitted at a hospital for incurables, but it hadn't been possible to secure him a place at the hospital for incurables. He was happy to receive, and in fact delighted in receiving visitors, and perhaps the first visitor that we know about, certainly in the film, is played by Anne Bancroft, and is the actress Madge Kendall. Mrs. Kendall, named in the film, is a real figure. She was a real actress, and she and her husband were very successful on the London stage in the latter part of the 19th century. Joseph loved the theatre, of course, and the presentation of his going to the theatre in the film is quite a moving element.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance was very special to me, because it was very special to someone else. A man who knows the theatre and who loves the theatre, and yet this is the very first time he's ever been here. I wish to dedicate, the whole company wishes to dedicate with all their hearts, tonight's performance to Mr. John Merrick, my very dear friend.
The character of Madge Kendall is important in the film. She becomes something of a mother to Joseph Merrick, and in fact at the final scenes of the film where Joseph lies down to sleep like other people, you see a portrait, a photograph of Joseph's mother on his mantelpiece, but perhaps even more prominently a photograph of Mrs. Kendall, which he describes as his most prized possession. As a mother figure to Joseph, she helps him to become to terms with his disabilities and to find some contentment. And this is an important aspect of the film as portrayed by David Lynch. Joseph liked to give presents. One of the presents that he gave has survived to this day, and it's a model church of German manufacture, and this he made for the actress Madge Kendall probably around 1886, when he was first resident at the hospital. One of Joseph's proudest possessions was a gentleman's dressing case, and he is described as using the dressing case and taking great pride in it to an almost pathetic degree by Frederick Treves. He was also given gifts by Princess Alexandra, who visited Joseph in his rooms at the London hospital. Princess Alexandra comments in her own journal how touching she found her encounter with Joseph Merrick. One of the most memorable parts of David Lynch's film is the death of Joseph Merrick at the end of the film. And this echoes the scene as told by Treves in the 1923 Reminiscence, where Joseph wants to sleep like other people. In fact, he'd sustained his life up to that point by sleeping with his head resting on his knees, and because his head had grown so large, he would have suffered from great distress and even asphyxia if he tried to lie down to sleep like other people. It's important to see in the film that Joseph chooses to lie down to sleep, that he sees himself like other people, that he has been humanized by the kindness and love he's been shown. In fact, his death is a bit of an enigma, because we know that he was brought his lunch, that he was comfortable in the morning of the day of his death, and that he was found by doctors during the afternoon. It's interesting, and we know this from evidence produced at his inquest, that he was found lying across his bed, that he didn't tuck himself up in bed, but that it appears that he was trying to get up, that possibly he had a stroke or a mild heart attack or some kind of relapse, had fallen back and was unable to right himself. And his death certificate states that he died from asphyxia, that is suffocation caused by the weight of his head, and the causes of death are given as natural. Well, Joseph himself attributed his disease to a fright or an encounter his mother had with an elephant when she was heavily pregnant with him in 1862. And researchers have found out that, in fact, an elephant did escape from Womble's circus in Leicester about the time when she was pregnant with him, so it's possible she did have some kind of encounter. But that's not the reason that Joseph was suffering from the disease. We know that Joseph started to develop bony and fleshy tumours by about the age of 2. So it appears that Frederick Treves was right when he described the case as being one of congenital deformity. That is, that both Joseph and possibly also his sister were suffering from a disease that they were born with, perhaps a genetic defect. His sister was also, according to her death certificate, crippled from birth. It's been argued over the years as to what Joseph was actually suffering from. If you look at the inpatient register, compiled in 1886 for London hospital inpatients, it says that Joseph was suffering from elephantiasis. Elephantiasis is an inflammatory disease, an acquired disease. It's often something you find in tropical Africa and tropical countries. And it's certain that Joseph was not suffering from elephantiasis. There's good suspicion that Joseph might have been suffering from neurofibromatosis 1, possibly complicated by another disease, fibrous dysplasia. If you look at the X-rays and photographs of Joseph Merrick, there's lots of pathology shown, and if you look at different parts of the body, for example, looking at the femur, it looks a bit like he's got Paget's disease. In the 1980s, 2 American doctors came up with a new diagnosis. Tibbles and Cohen suggested that Joseph was suffering from a disease called the Proteus syndrome, a very, very rare genetic disorder, of which there's only a few cases described in the medical literature. That diagnosis has found favour, and there have been several attempts now to extract DNA from Joseph's remains to try to establish whether he in fact was suffering from Proteus syndrome, or whether he had neurofibromatosis, whether he had another disease entirely. But so far we haven't been able to establish exactly which disease he was suffering from. So it's almost possible to say, as one researcher has suggested, he was suffering from Merrick's disease.